This case, Great Dunmow, is home to a murder case which I think is unique in English legal history. The story actually starts just south of Ridgewell, and there's a very large semicircular lay-by with a ditch separating the road from some fields. On the 3rd of January 1961, a man on his way to work stopped for after a call of nature, and he found the body of a young woman there. She'd been thrown head first into the rain-filled ditch. Police were called, and also a man called Francis Camps, very, very eminent pathologist. And it was pretty obvious that the girl had been strangled. She was still clothed, there was no coat, no shoes, and no handbag. And the unusual thing was her hair had been cut short. Not expertly cut short, but roughly hacked short. Was this an attempt to disguise who she was? They weren't sure. Well, they started questioning passing motorists, cafe shops. No one knew who she was. And so a description was published in the evening paper. And that was when a Mrs. Francis Constable of Halstead became very alarmed, because the description matched her daughter Jean, who she hadn't seen since New Year's Eve. Jean had said to her mother she was going to a party in London with some friends. And don't worry, she said, I'll look for a job in London. Now, Jean had been known beforehand to stay out with friends overnight, so her mother hadn't particularly worried, and she hadn't reported her missing. So Mrs. Constable went to the police, and they took her to the mortuary, and she identified the body of her daughter. There were 2 items of jewellery missing. Jean Constable was 20, and she was working in a plastics factory in Bocking again. She was an attractive girl, very vivacious, although she had a rather dull day job. She used to have a very lively social life, lots of dancing to rock and roll, to drinking and so on. And she particularly liked mixing with young American airmen. They were stationed at Wethersfield. Now, the police soon discovered that Jean had not in fact gone to London, and she'd actually not gone any further than Braintree, where she'd been drinking at the Bell Public House. She was a bit tiddly. Someone had seen her. She was in very high spirits, and she'd left the pub with 2 men, an American airman and a civilian. So the police went to Wethersfield to question the airman. And when they spoke to Staff Sergeant Willis Eugene Beauchers, he noticed that he had a bruise under his left eye and a graze on his face. So they said, where did you get those injuries? And he said, I don't know. This was highly suspicious. And Beauchers soon found himself being very closely interviewed by a police inspector. He finally admitted that he'd known Jean, he'd met her and her civilian boyfriend on New Year's Eve, and he'd been drinking whiskey and beer. He'd recently had his teeth extracted. This was actually quite important, because what it meant was he couldn't eat very much. That day he'd eaten very little solid food at all. He'd spent most of his day drinking. He had a flat at number 4, the Close, Great Dunmow. So he'd invited Jean and her civilian boyfriend back to the flat for more drinks. They spent an hour or 2 drinking vodka, and he said that he had passed out, and when he'd woken up, the other 2 had gone. The inspector said he wasn't satisfied with that story. Beauchers said, I may as well tell you the truth. He then made a full statement, and he then handed the policeman a tensioning note and Jean's watch, which he said he'd taken from her bag. He was arrested and charged with her murder. Beauchers was 29 years old. He joined the American Air Force in 1949 and served in Korea and Japan. He had a wonderful array of medals. He'd been to Prestwick in Scotland. He'd met a young woman called Jane Cunningham, and they'd got married, and they'd gone to America. They had 2 daughters, and then later on he was transferred to Wethersfield. Now, Jane was expecting another child, so she decided to go up to Scotland to have the child and also stay with her family. And so she was up there in Scotland at the time all this had happened. Beauchers told the police that Jean Constable and her boyfriend had all been to his flat, had all been drinking, they'd been dancing to the radiogram, and Jean and the young man had gone into the bedroom together. And Jean had then gone to sleep on a mattress in front of the fire. The young man had gone, he'd gone to get a taxi, Beauchers had lain down beside Jean to sleep. This is a quote from his statement, because he said he had passed out, and because he and Jean were now alone in the flat. The next thing I remember was something scratching and pulling at my mouth. I opened my eyes and Jean was lying there under me, and I had my hands round her throat. She was dead then. He had no recollection of how this had happened. There was a bit of a shock. He was suddenly sobered him up, as you can imagine. He didn't know what to do. In fact, the body stayed in the flat for 2 days. Eventually, he washed and dressed the body, hacked off her hair, attempted disguising her, burned her handbag, her coat, her shoes and all that stuff, put the body into his car and dumped it in the ditch. The only people who might have heard what was going on, there was a flat above with a sergeant and his wife, and they had heard what sounded like sobbing at about 1:30 in the morning. But who was this mysterious civilian boyfriend? Well, the next day, a young man of 20, called David Salt, read the newspapers and suddenly realised that he was the person concerned. So he went to the police and he said that he had met Jean, had been drinking at the Nag's Head, and they'd gone to the Bell, met up with Beauchers, and he confirmed that when he left, Jean was with Beauchers and she was still alive. Well, the American Air Force wanted the case to be tried by an American court-martial rather than a British civil court, but this was something that had happened. It was the murder of a British citizen on British soil. It was held that it was going to be tried here, and so he was committed for trial at Chelmsford Assizes. But what was his defence going to be? It was one of the most unusual ever to be offered in a court of law, and at the time it was unique. He said that he was innocent of the murder because although he was quite sure he had strangled her, he said he'd done it while he was asleep.